When most people wake up, they assume their body is starting a new day. In reality, it started hours earlier. Long before your eyes opened, cells across your body were already preparing for what comes next. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, an old female orca leads her pod through open water. She has not given birth in over a decade. By almost any measure used elsewhere in the animal kingdom, she should be biologically irrelevant. Instead, she is the one everyone follows. When salmon runs collapse and younger whales grow disoriented, it is her memory of feeding grounds decades old that keeps her family alive. In every sense that matters to evolution, she is still working. This single fact breaks something most people assume about biology. We tend to treat reproduction as the entire point of a body. Stop reproducing and nature should stop investing in you. But across the animal kingdom, that pattern almost never holds. In a comparison of 52 wild mammal species, only 3 showed a real, measurable stretch of healthy life spent well after reproduction ended. Humans, killer whales, and short-fin pilot whales, that's it. Out of thousands of mammal species on Earth, this exact trait, surviving years or decades past your last offspring, shows up in almost no one. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If menopause were simply decline, why would it independently appear in a hairless bipedal primate and a marine mammal from a completely different branch of the evolutionary tree? Most people assume menopause is just aging catching up with the ovaries. Get old enough and the reproductive system eventually runs out, the same way skin loses elasticity or hair turns gray. That explanation feels intuitive, it is also incomplete. If menopause were only decline, we would expect it everywhere in nature, in every species that lives long enough. We don't. Female elephants can reproduce into their 60s. Chimpanzee females, for the most part, keep cycling almost until the end of life. So something else is happening here. Something selective, something that required a very specific set of evolutionary pressures to appear at all. Evolutionary biologists have actually been wrestling with this puzzle for a long time. Back in the late 1950s, researchers first framed it as a genuine contradiction. Why would natural selection ever favor a female who survives well past the point where she can pass on her own genes directly? That question sat largely unresolved for decades. It wasn't until researchers began combining demographic records with evolutionary modeling that the pieces started coming together, and killer whales became the species that finally supplied the clearest answers. To understand what's actually happening inside the human body, it helps to start with what menopause biologically is. Every woman is born with a fixed number of egg-containing follicles in her ovaries. There is no resupply. It is one of the only cell populations in the human body that can never be replenished. Over decades, that supply slowly depletes. As follicles disappear, the ovaries produce less estradiol and less of a hormone called inhibin. Inhibin normally signals the brain to ease off. When that signal fades, the brain compensates by pushing out more follicle-stimulating hormone, trying to force a response the ovaries can no longer give. For a while, this creates hormonal turbulence. Cycles grow irregular, with some months bringing surges of estrogen and others almost none. Eventually, the ovaries stop responding altogether. Hormone levels settle at a new, lower baseline and menstruation ends for good. This is why the transition itself, not just the endpoint, can feel disruptive. The body isn't quietly powering down. It's recalibrating, sometimes for years, before finding a new equilibrium. The most familiar symptom, the hot flash, isn't random discomfort. Researchers believe it stems from a disruption in the brain's temperature control system, the internal thermostat that normally keeps body heat within a narrow, stable range. When estrogen shifts, that thermostat's tolerance narrows. The body overreacts to small temperature changes by trying to cool itself rapidly. There are longer-term consequences too, and they matter more than most people realize. Estrogen plays a direct role in maintaining bone density. When it drops, bone loss accelerates, sometimes rapidly in the years right after the final period. The risk of fracture rises and cardiovascular risk shifts as well, since estrogen also supports blood vessel health. None of this is exaggeration. Health organizations worldwide treat menopause as a major physiological transition, not a footnote of aging, one that affects sleep, bone strength, heart health, and long-term quality of life. There's a modern wrinkle here worth pausing on. For most of human history, relatively few women lived far beyond the age when menopause typically occurs. Today, the average woman in the United States reaches menopause around age 52, and many will go on to live another 3 or 4 decades beyond that point. That means the body is now navigating years of low estrogen exposure on a scale evolution never had much reason to plan for in detail, which is part of why ongoing medical research into bone health, heart health, and healthy aging during this stage carries so much weight. So the human side of this mystery is well understood. Follicles run out, hormones shift, the body adjusts. But that still doesn't explain why this trait would exist at all. Why would evolution allow a female to survive for decades with no further reproductive output? For that answer, we have to leave land entirely. In the waters off Washington State and British Columbia, scientists have tracked the same family groups of killer whales for over 4 decades. It is one of the longest continuous wildlife studies ever conducted, and it has quietly rewritten what we know about menopause. Female killer whales typically stop reproducing in their 30s or 40s, yet they often live into their 60s, 70s, occasionally beyond 90. That gap, sometimes 50 years of life with no further calves, is almost unheard of anywhere else in nature. For a long time, no one could explain what these older females were doing with all that extra time. Then the data revealed a pattern. Post-reproductive female orcas were leading their pods, especially during difficult years. Researchers tracking group movement found that when salmon, their primary food source, grew scarce, it was consistently the oldest females who took the lead, guiding the group toward feeding grounds their memory alone could locate. In good years, when food was abundant, this leadership pattern faded. It only became critical during scarcity, exactly when accumulated knowledge mattered most. These grandmothers function as living archives of ecological memory, called on precisely when the group's survival depends on information no one else in the pod has. But leadership was only the beginning of what researchers found. Post-reproductive mothers were also directly improving the survival odds of their adult sons, more so than their daughters. Separately, grandmothers were shown to raise the survival odds of their, especially in years when salmon numbers were low or moderate, exactly when extra support mattered most. This wasn't a subtle statistical blip. It showed up again and again across different pods, different years, different research teams. At this point, the explanation seems to write itself. Grandmothers help, and helping increases the survival of your genetic relatives. From an evolutionary standpoint, that's reason enough to keep an older female alive and invested in her family's success, even after her own reproductive years have ended. This is often called the grandmother hypothesis. The idea was first formally proposed by anthropologists studying human hunter-gatherer societies back in the late 1990s. They noticed that older women who were no longer able to bear children were still spending enormous amounts of time and energy gathering food and caring for, effectively subsidizing their daughters' reproductive success. It's compelling, it's also on its own not the whole story. If helping alone explained menopause, we would expect the same pattern in other highly social, long-lived species with strong grandmother bonds. In at least one case, we don't see it. Asian elephants show powerful grandmother effects. Older females measurably improve the survival of their. And yet Asian elephants don't show clear-cut menopause. Females often keep reproducing well into old age, grandmothering or not. So helping behavior alone isn't enough to force evolution's hand. Something else has to be happening, something that makes continued reproduction actively costly, not just unnecessary. That's where the story sharpens. Researchers studying the same killer whale populations noticed something else in the data. When an older mother and her adult daughter reproduced within the same pod at the same time, the calves belonging to the older mother died at a significantly higher rate, nearly double the risk compared to calves born to the younger female. This wasn't a coincidence of bad luck. It reflected a deeper structural reality of how these whales live. In resident killer whale pods, both sons and daughters stay with their mother for life. Mating happens with whales from outside the group. Over time, this means an older female becomes surrounded almost entirely by her own close relatives, more so than a younger female would be. When she keeps reproducing in that environment, she isn't only competing for food against strangers. She's competing directly against her own children, and every calf she has laid in life pulls resources away from descendants who already share her genes. At that point, continued reproduction stops paying off, even in strictly genetic terms. The math flips. A female gains more by directing her energy toward the survival of existing relatives than by producing one more calf who now has to compete with family for food. This is the reproductive conflict hypothesis, and in killer whales, the evidence for it is about as direct as evolutionary biology gets. Researchers who have spent years studying these family groups describe the pattern plainly. Combine the cost of competing with your own daughter's offspring with the clear benefit older females provide once they step back from reproducing, and you get a strong evolutionary incentive for menopause to take hold, particularly in a species where relatedness to the surrounding group only deepens with age. It's worth pausing on how unusual that setup actually is. Most animals disperse as they mature, spreading out so that neighbors are rarely close relatives. Put those two forces together, helping relatives and avoiding costly competition with them, and you start to see why menopause would evolve at all. It isn't one clean explanation. It's two pressures reinforcing each other inside a very particular kind of social structure. But there's a third piece to this puzzle, and it came from research published just recently, and it changes how we think about the whole picture. For years, scientists assumed menopause evolved because these females cut their reproductive years short, stopping earlier than their body size or life expectancy would predict. The idea was that reproduction got truncated. New comparative research across multiple species of toothed whales found something different. It wasn't that reproductive years shortened. It was that total lengthened, while the reproductive window largely stayed the same. These whales didn't lose reproductive years. They gained decades of extra life on the other end, and evolution simply never extended fertility to match. That distinction matters enormously. It means menopause in whales isn't really about reproduction shutting down early. It's about survival extending late, opening a long window where a female's greatest evolutionary value comes from staying alive and useful, not from having more offspring. This same logic has been extended to explain why several other whale species, including belugas, narwhals, and likely false killer whales, also appear to carry this trait, based on evidence from their ovaries and life history patterns, even without the decades of direct observation researchers have collected on orcas. For these species, scientists can't rely on decades of direct behavioral tracking the way they can with orcas. Instead, they examine preserved ovaries from stranded or deceased whales, counting the tiny scars left behind each time an egg was released. By comparing how many of these scars appear at different ages, researchers can reconstruct roughly when ovulation slowed and eventually stopped, even in animals that were never observed alive. That method is how belugas and narwhals earned a place on this short list, alongside the far better studied orcas and pilot whales. Which brings us back to humans and to a question that has been quietly building throughout this investigation. If menopause requires this very specific combination, a long extended strong benefits from helping relatives and costly competition between generations, why would it show up in us at all? Human societies historically share some deep similarities with resident killer whale pods. In many traditional and ancestral human communities, older women remained closely connected to their children and often living nearby and sharing caregiving and resources. Historical demographic records from populations in Finland and Canada found something striking. Women who lived longer after their final pregnancy tended to have more surviving, not because they had more children themselves, but because their continued presence measurably improved the survival odds of already born. That's the grandmother hypothesis playing out in our own species, using real historical population data rather than assumption. At the same time, human social structures throughout much of our evolutionary history often involved women moving into their partner's community, gradually becoming surrounded by increasingly close genetic relatives as they aged, not unlike the pattern seen in orca pods. Under those conditions, the same logic of reduced reproductive conflict may have applied to us as well. The honest scientific answer is that no single explanation fully accounts for human menopause. Current evidence suggests it likely reflects both forces working together, helping benefits and reduced conflict, layered on top of a biology capable of extending survival well past the reproductive years. Some researchers argue the picture is broader still, and the full story is still being worked out. There's one more twist worth mentioning, because it recently challenged an assumption that had stood for decades. Scientists long believed humans were the only primates that experienced anything resembling menopause. Then a population of wild chimpanzees in Uganda showed hormonal and demographic patterns strikingly similar to human menopause. Females there were living well beyond their fertile years, with hormone markers matching what researchers see in postmenopausal women. It's a genuinely surprising finding, but researchers studying it have been careful not to overstate it. This is one specific chimpanzee population in one specific environment, and it remains unclear whether this reflects something typical of chimpanzees generally or something unique to the unusual ecological conditions at that particular site. Evidence is still emerging, and the scientific community is treating it as an open question rather than settled fact. What makes the discovery especially interesting is the social context surrounding it. Unlike orcas or humans, these chimpanzees don't rely on grandmothers sticking around to help raise offspring, since females typically leave their birth community once they mature. That suggests post-reproductive survival might be able to emerge for reasons beyond direct grandmothering, under the right ecological pressures, even in a species with a very different social structure than our own. It's a reminder that this trait may have more than one evolutionary route leading to it. So where does this leave us? Menopause is not a malfunction. It is not simply the reproductive system wearing thin with age, the way a tire eventually wears down. In both women and killer whales, it appears to be the result of very deliberate evolutionary math, a trade where continued survival and continued helping outweighs continued reproduction, inside a social world where family, memory, and cooperation matter as much as biology. For humans today, that framing carries real practical weight. We no longer live inside the small, tightly connected multi-generational groups our biology evolved within, but our biology hasn't caught up to that change. The transition itself remains medically significant, worth taking seriously rather than pushing through quietly. Bone density and cardiovascular health both shift measurably during and after this transition, and both respond well to informed medical guidance and monitoring rather than guesswork. Speaking with a healthcare provider about individual risk, and about which evidence-based options for symptom management and long-term health protection make sense for your situation, remains the most reliable path forward, more reliable than any generalized assumption about aging. Ongoing clinical research continues to refine how doctors approach this stage of life, from bone density screening to cardiovascular monitoring to therapies aimed at easing the transition itself. None of that research treats menopause as something to simply endure quietly, and neither should we. There is something worth sitting with in the idea that, in the ocean, the females most valuable to their family's survival are often the ones no longer reproducing at all. They're the ones who know where the food is when no one else remembers. They're the ones who reduce conflict simply by stepping back at the right time. Their value was never really about the calves they were still capable of having. It was about everything they had already learned. That old female orca, still leading her pod through open water decades after her last calf, isn't a biological leftover. She is, in the clearest evolutionary sense available, exactly where natural selection wanted her to be. And maybe that's the real reframe underneath this entire story. Not that menopause is something the body simply endures, but that it may be one of the more quietly remarkable adaptations evolution has ever produced, one that values memory, leadership, and connection just as highly as it ever valued reproduction itself. It also changes how we might think about aging more broadly, not just in orcas but in ourselves. A body that stops reproducing is not a body that has stopped mattering. If anything, the research suggests the opposite. The years that follow can be some of the most biologically consequential of a life, shaping whether children and entire communities thrive. Somewhere off a rocky coastline, that old female orca is still swimming, still leading, still remembered by a family that depends on her. She never needed to have another calf to remain essential. She simply needed to stay alive, stay present, and keep doing what only she, with decades of accumulated experience, still knew how to do.